The legacy of the B-17 Flying Fortress is inseparable from the story of World War II itself. It was not simply an airplane. It was an idea made real in aluminum, fuel, and courage, sent into the sky at a moment when the outcome of the war was still uncertain and the cost of failure was unthinkable. When the Boeing B-17 first appeared in the late 1930s, it looked unlike anything else flying at the time. Large, four engined, and bristling with defensive guns, it was built around a radical belief that a bomber could defend itself, that it could fly deep into enemy territory in daylight, survive intense opposition, and return home. That belief would be tested more harshly than anyone anticipated. Before the war, air power theorists argued that destroying an enemy's industrial capacity could shorten conflicts and reduce casualties on the ground. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, aircraft plants, if those could be neutralized, the enemy's ability to fight would collapse. The B 17 was designed to be the instrument of that strategy. When the United States entered the war, the skies over Europe were already deadly. Britain had learned through devastating losses that unescorted daylight bombing was nearly suicidal. The Royal Air Force shifted to nighttime operations, sacrificing accuracy for survival. The United States Army Air Forces chose a different path. They committed to daylight precision bombing, believing that tight formations of B 17s flying in carefully structured defensive boxes could protect themselves through overlapping fields of fire. In theory, German fighters would be driven off by sheer volume of machine gun fire. In reality, the early missions were brutal. B 17 crews flew into heavily defended airspace day after day. German fighters attacked relentlessly. Anti aircraft fire, known as flak, exploded around formations with terrifying precision. Entire crews were lost. Some missions suffered loss rates so high that by modern standards they would be considered unthinkable, and yet the missions continued. The Flying Fortress earned its name not because it was invulnerable, but because of what it endured. Photographs from the war show B 17s returning to base riddled with holes, engines destroyed, tails partially gone, wings shredded, yet somehow still airborne. Crews often survived damage that should have sent the aircraft spiraling into the ground. That durability became legend, but the true cost was human. Each B 17 carried a crew of 10: pilot, co pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and gunners. When a bomber went down, 10 lives were at stake. Thousands of B 17s were shot down over Europe. Survival odds were grim, especially early in the war. Completing a full tour of missions was statistically unlikely. Crews flew anyway. They flew knowing that every mission might be their last. What sustained them was not confidence in the machine alone, but belief in the mission, a belief that what they were doing mattered, that each factory destroyed and each sortie flown brought the war closer to an end. The B 17 became the backbone of America's strategic bombing campaign in Europe. Its targets were not random: aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, oil facilities, transportation networks. The goal was attrition, not terror, to grind down the enemy's ability to wage war. Over time, the impact was undeniable. German aircraft production was repeatedly disrupted. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training and operational readiness. Rail systems were stretched beyond capacity. Perhaps most critically, the Luftwaffe was forced to fight. To stop the bombers, Germany had to commit its fighter force. And when long range escort fighters like the P 51 Mustang arrived, the balance shifted decisively. German fighter losses mounted. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. By 1944, the Allies controlled the skies. The B 17 did not win the war alone. No single aircraft or weapon ever does. But it played a central role in weakening Germany's war machine, shortening the conflict, and enabling the invasion of Europe. The psychological impact was enormous. For civilians on the ground, the sight and sound of hundreds of bombers overhead was overwhelming. For German leadership, it represented a failure to defend their own territory. For Allied nations, it was proof that the fight was being taken directly to the heart of the enemy. And for the crews, the B 17 became home. Aircraft were given names. Nose art was painted. Crews trusted their machine as a partner in survival. When engines failed, when controls froze, when flak tore through the fuselage, that trust was tested again and again. Many flying fortresses never came back, but those that did carried stories that would last a lifetime. After the war, the legacy of the B 17 only grew. Veterans returned home with memories that shaped how the conflict was remembered. Surviving aircraft were preserved. Museums, books, films, and documentaries turned the Flying Fortress into a symbol of sacrifice and endurance. The aircraft also left a permanent mark on aviation design. Lessons learned from the B 17 influenced future bombers and transports. Redundancy, structural strength, and crew survivability became priorities. The airplane proved that durability mattered as much as speed or altitude. It also shaped how air power was understood. The debate over strategic bombing continues to this day. Questions about effectiveness, morality, and civilian impact are still examined by historians. The B 17 sits at the center of that debate, not as a simple answer, but as evidence of how total war forced nations into difficult choices. What cannot be debated is the courage of those who flew it. Young men, often barely out of their teens, climbed into unpressurized, unheated aircraft and flew into combat at high altitude, facing freezing temperatures, enemy fire, and staggering odds. They did it not once, but dozens of times. That courage is the true legacy of the Flying Fortress. The B 17 did not just drop bombs, it carried the weight of a strategy, the burden of expectation, and the lives of 10 people at a time into the most dangerous airspace of the war. It helped clear the skies for victory, and it helped define what air power could accomplish and what it would cost. Today, when one of the remaining flying fortresses flies overhead, people still stop and look up. Not because it is fast or sleek, but because of what it represents: endurance, sacrifice. In a generation that carried the war into the sky, mission after mission. Near the end of this story, it is worth acknowledging that the B 17's legacy did not end in 1945. Some aircraft survived for decades, carefully restored and flown so history could be experienced, not just displayed. One such flying fortress, meticulously maintained and flown by dedicated stewards, was lost in a mid-air collision during an air show in Dallas in 2022. Its loss was tragic, but it also stood as proof that these airplanes were more than museum pieces. They were living examples of history, kept airworthy out of respect for the crews who once depended on them. That aircraft, like all B 17s, served a purpose far beyond metal and machinery. The Flying Fortress will always be remembered for what it did in World War II, but also for what it continues to represent: the cost of courage, the weight of responsibility, and the idea that history is not something we only read about. Sometimes history flies overhead. And when it does, the B 17 reminds us of a time when the outcome of the world depended on crews who climbed into the sky, knowing the risks and went anyway.